when we, earlier this year in April, when we launched our Hyderabad chapter, we had Aishwari Kumar, our second speaker for tonight, in the country, and we introduced him as an unknown quantity. And the idea of introducing him as an unknown quantity turns out is particularly prescient, not because he himself is unknown, because in his own domain, he's a political philosopher, political theorist, an intellectual historian. He did his doctoral work at Cambridge. He has taught at Stanford for the last 13 years, and he is a celebrated authority in his field. But what is interesting about the words unknown quantity is that he has taken two figures fundamental to the Indian modern state, to Indian political thought, people we think we know from inception, and demonstrated to us that they are in fact unknown quantities. These two figures are everyday names to us, Mohandas Gandhi and B.R. Ambedkar. And in the hands of this formidable young scholar, they are not just unknown quantities, but they are complementary in a way that no scholarship before has shown them to be. We're in for a really fascinating conversation, and it's my privilege to invite up on stage Aishwari Kumar.
Thank you for having me. Wow.
Aishwari, it's almost going to sound a rude question, but in 2019, why should we care about Gandhi and Ambedkar? Or let me put it in a more personal frame. Why did a young scholar in this day and age devote the better part of his scholarship to Gandhi and Ambedkar?
Well, I was young when I started working on them, so it has taken me almost 14 years. I mean, the book took 10 years. But to address the more provocative dimension of your question first, why should we care? We should care because we should care about the idea of India. We should care about Gandhi and Ambedkar because these two, to my mind, reflect the two most foundational and at the same time most antagonistic visions of what we as a society, what we as a country, what we as a state should embody. We should care about them above all because the question of justice is a timeless question. The question of inequality is a timeless question, and nowhere has it been, and at no given time in our own modern history have these questions been so fundamental to who we are. And these are not historical questions. What we are today as a society, how muscular and militaristic we are, how numb we are to the everyday cruelty we see around us, how powerfully organized religion has taken over conceptions of state that were initially geared towards a certain form of religious equality. All those questions are timeless questions, but they become more and more important and have become more and more pressing and urgent in our own time. And if Ambedkar and Gandhi do not give us an insight into those questions, I don't think we have moral resources to address those questions at all.
So, Gandhi and Ambedkar are both usually studied in opposition to each other as antagonists, as you mentioned. But in your re-examination of them, what are their shared concerns, even if they have different approaches to their shared concerns? What are the central concerns that occupied their political imagination?
So there are factual elements of the answer that one can give. The question of...
Will you just hold the mic a little bit?
Yeah, sorry. The question of what an Indian state should look like. What should everyday life in India between people of India look like? We are an extremely diverse society. When people in Europe think about Indian democracy, one of the things they forget is that we are, as one state, more diverse than the entire European Union put together. We have more classical languages than European Union has nation states. We find some of the moral resources of answering this intractable diversity of India in Ambedkar and Gandhi. But really what brings them together, to answer it in a philosophical sense, is that they are the two thinkers most concerned with the future of India. They are the two thinkers who are most involved with. Ambedkar, factually speaking, is involved with the Constitution of India. Gandhi is involved with the question of the violence he sees around him. He addresses it in a more limited fashion than Ambedkar does. Although Ambedkar is not often seen as a thinker and a theorist of violence. But really the pressing issue that joins them is what would be India if we were to rule ourselves. We have been so accustomed to being ruled by others, especially in their own time by the British. And it is important to remember that neither Gandhi and Ambedkar, and they're singular in this way, actually see any alien rule as absolutely alien. There is absolutely nobody for these two thinkers that is absolutely alien to the idea of India, including the British. Gandhi actually turns it around in 1909, more than a century ago, when he says, the British have not taken India, we have given it to them. It's us who need to look inside, inward. And one of the ironies of, addressing your question more directly, one of the ironies of our interpretation of our political thought is that we see these thinkers to be antagonistic. But the only thinker who answers Gandhi's question as to why it is and how it is that we need to look inwards today is B.R. Ambedkar. And that concern with looking inwards is central to both of them.
So Ambedkar in particular is often spoken of as a constitutional jurist and of course as the draftsman of the Constitution, but you have argued with great conviction that he is one of the foremost political thinkers of our time, of that time, and of political thought. What would you be able to distill for us? What are the central principles, if you will, of Ambedkar's political thought and his political vision for India? Not constitutional vision, but political vision for India.
Look, to answer that question in a more overarching fashion, we need to remember that constitutionalism stands for one major principle, which is the separation of powers. The modern constitutional tradition sees the executive, the judiciary, and the parliament as three pillars that are distinct, that have a system of checks and balances, and that therefore can manage the diversity and the complexity of a political system through a mechanism of self-control and self-balance. Now, it is fair to argue that as a draftsman of the Indian Constitution, the president of the drafting committee, the chairman of the drafting committee, B.R. Ambedkar is and remains a foremost constitutional theorist. But what we forget in doing so, or in understanding him in such a fashion, is that he's a thinker first and foremost of political justice. That it's not the separation of power, but the futility of power that Ambedkar is centrally concerned with. It is not the power vested in the executive or the judiciary, but actually the idea that the real power must reside with the people themselves, the masses themselves, that is central to him. And the constitutional tradition is split on how much power the people really should have. Do we have a say in how we govern ourselves? Are we willing to and capable of taking these decisions about how we should rule ourselves? And most fundamentally, and this is the question that Ambedkar is centrally concerned with, is can the people really rule?
So a linked question is the fact that both of them were also concerned about the tyranny of the majority. So while they're concerned with can people really rule themselves, the idea of the majority is running away with itself has occupied both Gandhi and Ambedkar. Did they have similar positions on it? Were they speaking of majority as parliamentary majority or as mob majority?
Both, because they both are aware that at some level, if you have democracy, the principle of the majority decision, that is to say, the majority that votes for a certain government, is crucial to political life and to democratic life. On the other hand, Ambedkar, and this is why I think he remains, for me, the only thinker that makes contemporary India legible to us. The paradoxes, the violence, the inequality, our indifference to our own cruelty. Ambedkar is a singular lens into our indifference today, partly because, or substantively because, he believes that there is in India, or there has been in India, always a tendency to conflate liberty with license, conflate majority decision with majority rule. The decision is democratic. When we choose a government with overwhelming majority, we have made a shared decision. And let's not forget the economy of scale. Right now, it takes about 63 to 65 million votes for a man to be elected to the White House, to the US presidency. The number of votes that Narendra Modi has increased between 2014 and 19 alone is upward of 75 million. We are speaking of a democratic system in scale, in scope, in ideological power, in the power to muster people's voices that is unprecedented in modern democratic history. And to think of that Ambedkar is a prophetic thinker in that way, because he's almost, even Nehru is a faltering thinker when it comes to the principle of the majority, the tyranny of the majority, as you call it. And this is a very famous expression, as we know. To me, what strikes as the core of Ambedkar's political thesis is simply this, that there are not one but two majorities in India. He says that in the 40s, that India has a political majority. We vote for a certain political party, we choose a certain government, and then we are split. Some of us will choose AIADMK, others will choose DMK, some will choose Shiv Sena, others BJP, and so on and so forth. A few will choose the Congress, sadly.
A few, yes.
Very, very few. And they should really think about that. But the problem here for Ambedkar is that the majority in India is not simply this political majority. It's a communal majority. And that's his expression. No matter who we vote for, there is something about us that unifies us and gives us an obdurate, violent power which we are actually not ashamed of exercising. It's a myth, but it's also a political miracle that somewhere along the line we came to believe that we were a country of nonviolence, when actually we are a country that is most wantonly, most abandoned when it comes to exercise of social violence.
So what is that, you said, that particular quality that does, in fact, make us a very violent, intrinsically violent society?
This is another point where Gandhi and Ambedkar come together, although they then tear apart. Yeah. And Ambedkar's point is very simple. And this is the question he often asks. What if our greatest cruelties, our greatest violence, lay not in acts of physical defilement? This is not to say that we don't physically harm others, we don't physically attack others of other castes, of other sexes, and women, and so on and so forth. We know that Ambedkar actually resigns eventually resigns from the Nehru cabinet because the Congress government initially is reluctant and then thwarts his Hindu Code Bill, which was one of the most radical legislative efforts to give Hindu women the right to property. So the fundamental idea that he poses, or the question he poses, is what if we understood our cruelty not to be a function of physical attack, physical violence, but actually physical hesitation? What if we were cruel not by touching others, but actually by refusing to touch others completely? And I think that is the central, most poignant, most tragic.
And caste is obviously a key consideration here. So, and you have said somewhere that non-violence overdetermines Gandhi in the same way that caste seems to overdetermine Ambedkar. But caste is a central preoccupation for both. What are their different approaches to what seems to be a shared worldview?
When I said that, that's a good question. When I said that, what I really meant was that it is another miracle that Gandhi has come to be, or Gandhi has been established as a thinker of nonviolence. Gandhi is less a thinker of nonviolence than he is a thinker of calibrated violence. Ambedkar is less a thinker of caste than he is a thinker of political freedom. He comes to caste, of course he's born outcast, he's a prodigy who has to take the surname of his Brahmin teacher in order to go abroad, study that surname. In fact, when he meets Gandhi for the first time, Gandhi, after he leaves, they have a kind of a bitter meeting, and when he leaves, Gandhi asks one of his assistants, I don't understand why Ambedkar is so angry for the untouchables, so-called. And the aide answers, because he is one. And then it strikes Gandhi that Ambedkar, which could be a Brahmin surname, is actually a Dalit. The prejudice we have, and this episode is very interesting because it tells us about the deep prejudice that we have built into our very birth, and we grew up with unconsciously when we encounter someone who's not like us, who doesn't look like us, who doesn't speak like us, who does not dress like us, and so on. And caste is one vector of this intractable difference. For Ambedkar, caste is the root cause, but the eradication of caste is only one step towards what his fundamental question to India is. Are we really free? Or are we capable of being free at all? He does not, for example, for all his dislike of the Vedic tradition and so on, discount the idea that it's a tradition of genius. I mean, one of the things about Ambedkar is also how rigorously he reads the tradition he so detests. And that's not easy.
The Gita in particular, he reads with fair amount of rigor.
Yeah.
And will you tell us a little about his reading of the Gita?
Ambedkar comes to both the Gita and the larger epic tradition very early in the 1920s when he starts his political career after returning from New York and London. Is spent invoking the Mahabharata as the text that everyone should read. In fact, he in some of the major movements where he burns copies of the Manusmriti and so on, he often tells his followers that we are the Pandavas. And somewhere along the line, he realizes that the moral resources necessary for the critique of this emerging idea of India are not available in that epic tradition. They are not available in the epic tradition not because it does not have a theoretical genius, not because it does not already address with great finesse the insoluble problem that we encounter, which is the problem of violence, but because the resolution that our tradition offers us, the desire for the state, the Gita, let us not forget, is a poem on fratricide. it's one figure who the Hindus consider God, invokes the supreme warrior Arjuna, or declares to him that the only duty that he has is to kill his brothers in order to regain the state and the territory. And in the entire tradition that we have, beginning from the 19th century down to the 50s, there is not another thinker who actually calls out the Bhagavad Gita for what it really is. This is not to say that Ambedkar does not appreciate the genius of the tradition. It is that he is willing to stare it in the face and ask us whether we are capable of addressing what really constitutes us as a people, which is not nonviolence, which is not democracy, which is not even violence, but actually which is our combined, shared, collective indifference. And I think that is crucial.
Just to stay with the Hinduism critique, both Gandhi and Ambedkar, while they hold different positions, offer up or seem to stand for critiquing or at least examining Hinduism in the way it's been cast. And we've had this conversation before. How then is there an attempt by the Hindu right to appropriate both these thinkers? Because if they stand for something, they seem to stand in opposition to Hinduism as it is cast. So in what way of seeing both Gandhi and Ambedkar is the Hindu right able to find resonance?
In them?
Yeah.
The Hindu right can find resonance in pretty much everyone because they don't care to read anyone. So once you desist from reading anything, it's very easy. For example, some of the recent claims made by Venkaiah Naidu about Ambedkar in 370 were clearly not inaccurate. They were actually not Ambedkar's quotations, they were taken from Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. With Gandhi, of course, they have a more checkered history. With Gandhi, they found it more convenient to just assassinate him and then take him over. That they cannot do to Ambedkar, thankfully. But the idea of what is fundamental, I think, and which is a more important dimension of your question, is what is it that we do with thinkers that remain inappropriable? What is it that we can do with texts and traditions that give us the resources today to understand our contemporary moral and political dilemma? And I think part of why we appropriate a thinker, part of why we want the thinker on our side, is because we too, in our deepest antagonism, realize that the moral resources lie with these thinkers. The same cannot happen with Nehru. If you look at the rhetoric that the current ruling dispensation has, or the Hindu right has traditionally had towards Nehru, is downright disdain, as if almost all the ills of our contemporary life can be squarely rested on the shoulders of one man. And that is another strategy. And that strategy works because Nehru is at once more and less threatening. Nehru is at once less of a thinker and more of a statesman. With Ambedkar and Gandhi, the strife that the Hindu right has is actually at the level of conceptualization of our political life, not of the state, not of our territory, not of our military. Interestingly, the Narendra Modi government, which built the statue for Patel, is in itself ironic because Patel was the man who banned the RSS. So the other factual answer to your question is they do not have icons or heroes to actually celebrate. And so appropriation is part both of their political smarts, that they need to engage thinkers who give them those moral resources to address howsoever superficially the dilemmas that they want to address. And on the other hand, the fact that the Hindu right is particularly deficient in in a history of participation in the nationalist struggle. They have had very limited role in conceptualizing, let alone in struggling for the idea of India. The struggle for the idea of India did not have the Hindu right as an active participant, but it has to be brought in and grafted into it. And Ambedkar today has become, tragically, as he once feared, the primary rhetorical device through which that can happen.
There's two texts, one of each, that seem to stand central to their thought. In the case of Ambedkar, it is the annihilation of caste, and in the case of Gandhi, it is Hind Swaraj. Will you distill for us, and I know these are complex texts, but will you distill for us the central, again, the concern that both texts occupy?
And these are two, as many of us here know, these are two texts from two very different periods. Hind Swaraj, Gandhi writes actually on board a ship from London returning to South Africa. We forget that he spends much of his early political life outside of India. And much of the skepticism that Gandhi has about the idea of India comes from the fact that he fine-tunes his method of struggle abroad. So Hind Swaraj is 1909, written in South Africa. Annihilation of Caste is written equally paradoxically, not for Ambedkar's own followers, but actually for a conservative, reformist Hindu organization. It was supposed to be delivered as a lecture in Lahore, which when the organizing committee read the lecture, retracted the invitation. He didn't go at all. It was so radical for its time. Here is what I think, despite all these differences, unites them. It's the question that if we do not take care in understanding what is it that makes us political, why is it that politics is necessary, why do we feel so energized, charged, anxious, angry, resentful when we think about politics? If we have to understand that question, we need to understand the relationship in India between the majority and the minority. And we have been, in some ways, Gandhi and Ambedkar have prophetically proven that, that somewhere we have lost the thread of that question. The idea that, and Gandhi is very radical, the early Gandhi is pretty radical. In Hind Swaraj, he very directly says that history will prove that it is actually the minorities, that the minority is always in the right. And it's the majority that makes the wrong decision. But that is the logic and the risk of democracy, that that which is wrong will in the end rule us. And we need to understand this, the nature of this wrong.
So your book, and the book was published in 2015 at Stanford University Press, and the Indian edition released on the 15th of August. The book is called Radical Equality, Gandhi, Ambedkar, and the Risk of Democracy. What is the risk of democracy? Why is democracy a risk?
Democracy is, was conceptualized and conceived as a system of government in which it was believed that the people were capable of ruling themselves. And therefore, every moral and political decision that went into ruling ourselves, we were capable of taking. But most importantly, the moment when we arrive at making certain political decisions is also a moment when all our virtues and vices are distilled into one moment. Everything we have thought about, every prejudice we harbor, every generosity we cultivate, every act of courage that we embody, every single shred or figment of fear we have bred in ourselves, all of those elements and strands of our political and social life come together at one moment. It's when we cast our vote. The vote is not a mundane exercise. The vote is a condensation, it's a distillation of the balance between our virtues and our vices. The risk of democracy for these two, and I believe they are right, is that it is when our sense of liberty and our virtue is overtaken by our sense of arrogance that we are greater in number, that democracy dies. And democracy has died before. It is not very difficult to imagine a world in which democracy suddenly departs. It has happened, and it can again happen. The risk is whether we are able to anticipate when it is that we begin to spiral out into an anti-democratic common sense. The risk of democracy for Ambedkar and Gandhi is that while we are formally democratic, we may not have been ever, or we may have been unable or incapable of escaping that anti-democratic risk. That somewhere within us, while we are a robust, thriving, diverse democracy, political democracy, we remain socially prejudiced, we remain socially violent, and most importantly, we remain marked by indifference to our own political life.
Is it truly moral politics possible?
It is possible. A moral politics, a moral politics, I think for me, is a politics that asks a very simple question. What is the relationship between our politics and our truth? If you really distill that question down, it's whether we love our power more or whether it is truth that we love more. And a moral politics is a politics that gives a certain kind of gravity to our truth. And I think we are capable of that. As a society, with the diversity we have, with the traditions we have, we are... Now, this is the paradox of a moral politics, that it is in its moment of greatest strength, and right now we believe with the resurgence of a certain kind of nationalist or democratic nationalism, that we are at a high point of our national feeling. We might actually be at the weakest of our national feeling. Because the most robust, the most rigorous, the most formidable dimensions of our national life should be anchored in the idea that we can be and we are free to be criticized. A moral politics is possible if we believe that self-critique is the first principle through which we can come to a shared truth. And as long as we are willing to critique ourselves, look inward, as Ambedkar said, I think it is possible. It is still possible, and it's still not late.
Two last questions. One, where did both stand on the idea of patriotism?
They were both profoundly patriotic.
But how did they define patriotism?
Ambedkar defined patriotism as something that came from our shared everyday life, rather than our belief in or commitment to a certain kind of mythic civilizational discourse. Gandhi had a more civilizational dimension in which he thought about our political life. But to them, patriotism came from the idea of political critique. You are most patriotic when you are most skeptical of patriotism.
We're pretty much out of time. There is one other aspect I want to touch on, which is neither Gandhi or Ambedkar, but which is a different area, if not of your scholarship, then of your interest. And that is, the story there is also linked to your name. So Aishwari, while he goes by the name of Aishwari Kumar, he changed his name. He started out in life as Aishwari Ghosh. And I'd like you to tell us the story of how you changed names, because there is a different form of scholarship that followed from that.
Yes, yeah, that's true. And I often reply by saying that, and I've answered you before, that one of the things Ambedkar often says is, you know, it's a myth that Hindus believe that if you cross the 7 seas, you lose your caste. But actually, the Hindu takes his caste overseas. There is nothing more tensile and more powerful and unbreakable than caste. And one of the ways in which we identify ourselves as belonging to a caste, a gotra, a community, and so on, is the surname. I wish I could say that my reason for giving up caste, my surname was that, but it's actually not. It's a more banal, mundane. So when I was 8, I used to train and sing. And someone said, "Oh, you sound like Kishore Kumar." And I said, I want my name to sound like Kishore Kumar, so I took up the...
And I have asked this before. Do you sing like Kishore Kumar?
I don't, not at all, actually.
But we're going to ask, nonetheless, for you to humor us so we can decide. The majority decision that you have just written off?
The scholarship that comes out of it is more interesting for me, not the singing itself.
We'll take both.
Which is this book, as you know, I'm working on R.D. Burman, the music composer, Rahul Dev Burman. Rahul Dev Burman's father was a brilliant composer. So one of the songs S.D. Burman, the father, composes, but then falls ill. During the recording, R.D. finishes that. So that song is very dear to me.
I know you've said you have a bad throat, but please humor us.
As all our audience members have already heard me, I do have a bad throat.
The song you said is dear to you.
All right, I will do this, but with an advance.
Also, this is Chennai. They know music, no pressure.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, Chennai is especially difficult to sing in.
Aishwari, thank you. Gandhi and Ambedkar are obviously in good hands, but so it seems is Kishore Kumar.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Aishwari's book is also available outside. Please do use the opportunity to buy copies and have them signed. We will take just a 10 to 12-minute break to refill our glasses and come back for a conversation with Abhinav Bindra. Abhinav, thank you for waiting so patiently. We'll be back in just 10 minutes.